The wind that night carried the smell of rain and distant smoke. Evan Mercer stood at the end of a gravel driveway with a canvas duffel slung over one shoulder and a plastic grocery bag digging into his fingers. Behind him, the porch light flicked off. Just like that. 17 years old, not quite a man, not quite a child. Old enough apparently to be done with. "You can't stay here anymore," his mother's boyfriend had said, not cruelly, just firmly. "I won't keep feeding someone who doesn't belong to me." His mother had stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes tired in a way that didn't leave room for argument. Evan hadn't argued. He'd learned something about arguments in the past year. They didn't change outcomes. They just rearranged blame. So he packed what he could into a duffel, 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, a hoodie, a worn photo tucked inside a notebook, and he walked out. The sky hung low and heavy, clouds dragging across the edge of town like something undecided. He started walking because stopping would mean thinking. He walked past the gas station where he used to buy cheap candy after school, past the football field where he'd once imagined finishing his senior year, past houses with lights glowing warm behind curtains, none of them his. His father had left when he was 10. His mother had worked double shifts for years. Then came the boyfriend. Then came the slow tightening of space. 17 felt old when you wanted freedom. It felt very young when you had nowhere to sleep. By the time he reached the highway diner at the edge of Millstone Creek, his legs felt hollow. He pushed inside. A bell chimed above the door. The waitress, grey hair tied back loosely, looked up. "You look like you've walked a long way," she said. Evan shrugged. He ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and stretched the meal longer than necessary. He watched trucks roll past through the fogged glass. Morning arrived dull and damp. He stepped outside with $8 left after breakfast. $8 and some loose change. He checked his pockets twice, just to be sure the numbers hadn't changed. They hadn't. He wandered toward the courthouse square because it was warm inside public buildings, and warmth mattered. A paper taped to the announcement board caught his attention. County property liquidation, back taxes owed, minimum bid, $9. Evans stared at it. $9. He counted again. $8.73. He felt something twist in his chest. Almost enough. Almost. He stood there longer than necessary, then stepped into a pawnshop 2 doors down. He had one more thing in his pocket, his father's old pocket knife. Not valuable, not rare, but real steel. The shop owner examined it, tested the blade, ran a thumb across the handle. $7, he said. "It's worth more than that," Evan replied. "Maybe to you." Evan hesitated, then nodded. $7. He walked back to the courthouse with $15.73 in his pocket. The auction room was small, folding chairs set in uneven rows. The air smelled faintly of paper and dust. A handful of locals sat scattered around, mostly older men with crossed arms and expressions that suggested boredom more than interest. The clerk began reading properties in a steady, unremarkable tone. Then, "Uninhabitable cabin, north of Cedar Run, structure compromised, no utilities, minimum bid $9. Silence. A few heads tilted. Someone muttered, "That place?" Evan raised his hand. The clerk blinked. $9? Yes. Any other bids? None. Going once? A cough from the back. Going twice? The gavel tapped. Sold. Evan stood there for a moment, unsure whether he felt relief or regret. The deed felt thin in his hand. He owned something. It wasn't much, but it was land. It was wood. It was shelter. The walk to Cedar Run took nearly 3 hours. The road dissolved into dirt, then into twin tire tracks, then into nothing but a faint path pressed between tall weeds and scattered pine. When he saw the cabin, he stopped. It was worse than he expected. The roof sagged in the center. One side leaned outward slightly. The porch had collapsed entirely. The front window was nothing but jagged edges around a dark hole. It looked less like a house and more like something abandoned mid-collapse. "This is what $9 buys," he muttered. He stepped closer. The door hung crooked but intact. He pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The floorboards were warped. One wall had been patched years ago with mismatched planks, but the beams were solid. He knocked against one with his knuckles, hard, strong. Not everything was ruined. He walked the perimeter slowly, analyzing it the way his shop teacher once showed him how to evaluate a broken desk. Find the bones, ignore the skin. The roof's support beam had slipped from its notch, not snapped, just shifted. The left wall leaned because the foundation stones had sunk unevenly into the soil. Fixable, hard, but fixable. He set his duffel down and stepped back outside. The clearing was quiet. Cedar Run flowed faintly somewhere beyond the trees, barely audible. He realized something important. The cabin wasn't in the middle of nowhere. It was near water. Water meant options. That night, he slept in the corner least exposed to the broken window. He stuffed spare clothing into gaps between boards to slow the draft. The wind tested every seam. The structure groaned, but it didn't fall. Morning arrived with frost clinging to everything in sight. Evan stepped outside and drew a breath so cold it stung. He was 17. He owned a broken cabin. He had $6 left, and he had no backup plan. He started by clearing debris, broken shingles, collapsed porch boards, rusty nails half buried in dirt. He stacked anything usable in one pile, burnable scraps in another. His hands blistered quickly. He worked until his shoulders ached. By afternoon, the cabin looked slightly less like a ruin and slightly more like a project. He walked back to town, not to ask for help, to ask for work. He found small tasks easily enough, hauling crates behind the grocery store, cleaning gutters for an elderly couple, stacking firewood at a mechanic's house. People noticed him. "You're the kid who bought that old Mercer place," someone said. "Doesn't stand a chance," another replied quietly. Evan heard both. At the hardware store, a heavy-set man named Rick watched him sweep sawdust near the entrance. "You fixing that cabin?" Rick asked. "Trying," Evan answered. Rick studied him carefully. "Roof's your problem first," he said. "Doesn't matter how strong your walls are if water keeps getting in." Evan nodded. Rick disappeared into the back and returned with a small stack of warped shingles and a bent pry bar. "Can't sell these," he said. "Take 'em." Evan didn't smile, but his eyes lifted slightly. That evening, back at Cedar Run, he climbed onto the sagging roof carefully. He repositioned the slipped beam, hammered it back into its notch using a rock when his hammer bent, layered the salvaged shingles over the worst gap. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't symmetrical, but it was tighter. When the wind moved across the clearing that night, the roof rattled less. Inside, the cold still bit at his fingers, but something had shifted. He wasn't just surviving, he was stabilizing. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, and looked around at what $9 had bought him. Broken wood, crooked lines, a second chance no one else wanted. Outside, clouds began stacking low over Cedar Run. Winter wasn't far off, and no one in Millstone Creek expected that cabin to stand much longer. Not with a 17-year-old holding it up. If you've ever started with almost nothing and had people quietly expect you to fail, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Every place has its Cedar Run, and every broken structure holds a story. Because what happened next, no one in town saw coming. The first hard frost came 3 nights later. Evan woke before sunrise to the sound of wood snapping somewhere outside the cabin. For one disorienting second, he thought the roof had given in. It hadn't. The trees along Cedar Run were cracking under the weight of ice. He pushed himself upright, breath clouding the dim air. The inside of the cabin held a faint difference from the outside now. Not warm, Not comfortable, but less brutal. The patched roof had made that difference. He stepped outside and surveyed the clearing. The grass shimmered silver. The creek ran dark and steady between banks lined with frost. Water. He walked down to it and crouched. The surface was thinly iced at the edges, but moving in the center. He had water. That mattered more than he'd realized. Back at the cabin, he made a list in his notebook. Roof, temporary. Foundation, uneven. Window, exposed. Heat source, none. He needed a stove. He didn't have money for one. That afternoon, he went back into town and checked behind the scrapyard. The owner, a wiry man named Cal, had a habit of letting metal pile up before hauling it off. Evan waited until Cal stepped out of the office. "You looking for something?" Cal asked. "Just scrap. Anything that could be repurposed." Cal squinted at him. "You that kid who bought the Cedar Run place?" "Yes." Cal laughed softly. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that." Evan didn't respond. Cal studied him a moment longer, then jerked his chin toward a heap near the fence. "Old oil drum back there, rusted on one side but still solid enough. If you can haul it, you can have it." Evan didn't hesitate. The drum was heavy, awkward. He rolled it most of the way, dragging it the rest. It took him nearly 2 hours to get it back to the cabin. He stared at it for a long time. He'd seen homemade barrel stoves before, online videos, shop class experiments, cut the door, vent the top, attach a pipe. He didn't have proper tools, but he had the pry bar Rick gave him, a borrowed hacksaw from a mechanic who owed him for stacking wood, and stubbornness. By dusk, his hands were raw and bleeding, but the drum had a crude door cut into it. The stovepipe was harder. He scavenged sections of old ducting from behind a renovation site in town and pieced them together like mismatched bones. It wasn't pretty, it might not be safe, but it was something. When he lit the first small fire inside the drum, smoke filled the cabin immediately. He cursed under his breath and opened the door wide. The pipe joint leaked. He climbed onto the roof and adjusted the angle, packing mud around the gap to seal it temporarily. The second attempt worked better. Smoke rose. Heat began to gather. Slowly, cautiously. Evan sat back against the wall and extended his hands toward the barrel stove. The warmth was thin, fragile, but it was real. That night, he slept with the fire banked low and woke twice to feed it. The cabin still creaked, the wind still tested every seam, but he wasn't freezing. Word traveled quickly through Millstone Creek. "He's building a barrel stove," someone said at the gas station. "Out of scrap?" another asked. "Kid's going to burn that place down." Evan heard pieces of it when he walked past. He didn't defend himself. He worked. He dug around the foundation stones and lifted each corner slowly with a borrowed jack from Rick's store. He slid flat rocks underneath the sunken side to level the structure inch by inch. His muscles screamed by the third day. But when he stepped back, the cabin no longer leaned, not noticeably. That small change altered everything. The door shut easier, the roofline aligned better. The draft through the broken wall lessened. It was progress you could feel. On the fourth evening, snow began falling unexpectedly early. Not a blizzard, but steady. Evan stood in the doorway, watching flakes collect on the clearing. He felt a strange mix of fear and determination. This would be the first test. He double-checked the roof patches, reinforced the window plastic with an extra layer of boards, stacked firewood inside near the wall. When the snow thickened into real accumulation, the clearing changed shape. Sound dulled. The world shrank to the cabin and the tree line. The barrel stove burned steadily. The metal pinged softly as it heated. He sat with his back against the wall and listened. The snow pressed against the cabin gently at first, then heavier as wind joined in. The roof sagged slightly under the weight. Evan stood immediately and grabbed the shovel. He pushed the door open against the wind and climbed onto the roof in the dark. Each movement careful, each breath sharp. He cleared snow in sections, sliding it off before it could accumulate too deeply. By the time he climbed down, his hands were numb, but the roof held. Inside, he shut the door and leaned against it. He was shaking, not from fear, from effort. Morning revealed the clearing buried in white. The cabin stood, crooked still, patchy, unimpressive, but upright. He stepped outside and surveyed the area. Something caught his attention, smoke in the distance, not from town, from deeper in the tree line beyond Cedar Run. He frowned. No one lived out here, at least not that he knew of. The smoke thinned quickly and disappeared. He told himself it was probably a hunter's campfire. Still, something unsettled him. He shook it off and focused on clearing the path to the creek. Over the next week, temperatures dropped further. The barrel stove worked harder. Evan learned its patterns, when it drew well, when it needed the pipe adjusted. He lined the interior walls with cardboard and spare blankets for insulation. He hung a thick tarp across the draftiest section of the cabin, and slowly, unbelievably, the space began to feel less like a ruin and more like shelter. One afternoon, Rick drove out in his pickup. Evan saw the truck approaching from the ridge. Rick stepped out, boots crunching in snow. "Figured I'd see how crazy you are," Rick said. Evan stepped aside so he could enter. Rick surveyed the interior, the leveled floor, the patched roof, the barrel stove glowing steady. "You built that yourself?" "Yes." Rick ran a hand along one of the beams. "Huh." He stepped back outside and looked at the roofline. "You stabilized it?" "Had to." Rick nodded slowly. "Town said you'd last 2 weeks." Evan didn't hesitate. The drum was heavy, awkward. He rolled it most of the way, dragging it the rest. It took him nearly 2 hours to get it back to the cabin. He stared at it for a long time. He'd seen homemade barrel stoves before, online videos, shop-class experiments. Cut the door, vent the top, attach a pipe. He didn't have proper tools, but he had the pry bar Rick gave him, a borrowed hacksaw from a mechanic who owed him for stacking wood, and stubbornness. By dusk, his hands were raw and bleeding, but the drum had a crude door cut into it. The stovepipe was harder. He scavenged sections of old ducting from behind a renovation site in town and pieced them together like mismatched bones. It wasn't pretty, it might not be safe, but it was something. When he lit the first small fire inside the drum, smoke filled the cabin immediately. He cursed under his breath and opened the door wide. The pipe joint leaked. Evan didn't reply. Rick looked around the clearing. "You got enough wood?" "For now." Rick stood quietly for a moment. Then he walked back to his truck and returned with 2 proper stovepipe sections and a bag of insulation batting. "Don't tell anyone I gave you this," he said. "Makes me look soft." Evan swallowed once. "Thank you." Rick waved it off and climbed back into the truck. As the engine disappeared down the ridge, Evan stood alone again in the snow. 17, kicked out, living in a $9 cabin, and still here. That night the wind picked up harder than before. It came in long, forceful gusts that shook the trees and rattled the patched shingles. The storm warning on the radio he'd borrowed from town crackled with urgency. Heavy snow, high winds, rapid temperature drop. A real one this time. Evan checked everything twice. The new stovepipe held firm. The insulation tightened the gaps. The foundation stones remained steady. When the storm hit, it hit fast. Wind screamed through Cedar Run like something alive. Snow didn't fall, it slammed sideways. The cabin trembled. Evan stood in the center of it, listening. The barrel stove roared brighter. The roof groaned. For one long moment, he wondered if the town had been right, if $9 and stubbornness weren't enough. Then something else happened. A sound beneath the wind, a crash in the distance, then shouting, faint, through the storm. Evan's head snapped toward the door. Someone else was out here, and whatever was happening. No one in Millstone Creek expected it to involve the kid in the broken cabin. The shouting came again, faint, torn apart by wind, but unmistakable. Evan froze for half a second, listening hard enough that his ears rang. The storm was in full force now. Snow slashed sideways across the clearing. The trees along Cedar Run bent and groaned like they were trying not to snap. Then, another sound, metal grinding against something. A vehicle. He moved before he could think better of it. He shoved his boots on, grabbed the heavy flashlight Rick had slipped into the insulation bag without comment, and pulled his jacket tight. The moment he opened the door, the wind hit him like a wall. Breathing felt like inhaling knives. He stepped out and forced the door shut behind him so it wouldn't rip free. The shouting came again, this time clearer. "Hey, over here!" Evan angled toward the sound, leaning into the wind. Snow swallowed his boots nearly to the ankle. The beam of his flashlight bounced wildly in the white chaos. He followed the noise past the tree line. 30 yards in, he saw it. A pickup truck, nose down in a shallow ditch where the dirt road curved too sharply. One rear tire spun uselessly in the air. The passenger door was open. A man in his late 40s fought against the wind near the front tire, scarf half torn loose. A woman stood on the other side, gripping the doorframe. They both turned when the flashlight beam hit them. "You live out here?" the man shouted over the wind. "Yes. We lost control, can't get traction." The truck rocked dangerously with each gust. Evan assessed quickly. The ditch wasn't deep, but the angle was wrong. The more the tire spun, the worse it would dig. "You won't get it out tonight," Evan yelled back. "It's getting worse." The man hesitated. The wind answered for him, nearly knocking him sideways. "There's shelter," Evan shouted. "My place, this way." For a split second, doubt crossed the man's face. Then another violent gust made the decision. They grabbed what they could from the cab and followed Evan through the trees. By the time they reached the clearing, both of them were stumbling. Evan yanked the cabin door open and ushered them inside. The heat from the barrel stove wrapped around them immediately. The woman let out a shaky breath. "Oh my God," she whispered. The man bent forward, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. Evan shut the door tight and braced it against the wind. For a moment, the only sound inside was the stove crackling and the wind raging outside like it wanted in. "Thank you," the woman said finally, her voice trembling. "We didn't see the drift, it just slid." Evan nodded. "You can't drive out here in this," he said quietly. "It'll bury the truck." The man looked around the cabin. It wasn't impressive. Plywood patches, barrel stove, blankets tacked to walls, a sleeping bag in the corner, but it was solid. "This is yours?" the man asked. "Yes." "How long you been here?" "A few weeks." The man exchanged a look with the woman. "You're alone out here?" she asked. Evan hesitated. "Yes." The wind slammed against the cabin again, harder this time. Snow rattled the roof in waves. The man stepped closer to the stove and held his hands toward it. "I'm Daniel," he said. "This is my wife, Mara." "Evan." Daniel studied him more carefully now. "You're young." 17. Daniel raised his eyebrows. 17, he repeated softly, as if recalculating something. Outside, the storm intensified. The trees groaned louder. A crack echoed in the distance, one of them giving way under ice. Evan moved automatically, checking the stovepipe joint, tightening the wire around the seam Rick had replaced earlier. Mara noticed. "You built this?" she asked. "Yes." She ran her hand lightly along the reinforced beam near the ceiling. "It's steady." "It has to be." Daniel straightened and looked at the door as another violent gust hit. "Our truck won't survive that if it keeps up," he muttered. "Probably not," Evan said. The admission hung in the air. For a long moment, they just listened. Then something else happened. A deep, splintering crack. Closer. Evan's eyes snapped toward the north wall. Another crack, louder. The outermost tree at the edge of the clearing snapped under the weight of ice and wind. It fell, straight toward the cabin. There was no time to think. The impact hit the roof with a thunderous boom. The cabin jolted violently. Snow exploded through the air as the tree's upper branches scraped across the shingles. Mara gasped. Daniel swore under his breath. Evan looked up immediately. The main trunk had struck near the reinforced beam, the one he had realigned days earlier. The cabin groaned, but it held. Snow sifted down from the rafters. The barrel stove rattled but remained upright. For 5 full seconds no one moved. Then the wind continued. The roof remained intact. Daniel exhaled slowly. "That beam," he said quietly. "If that hadn't been secured, it would have punched through," Evan finished. Mara looked at him differently now, not with concern, with recognition. "You knew where the weak point was," she said. Evan shrugged slightly. "I checked it every day." Outside, the storm reached its peak. Visibility dropped to nothing. The world beyond the clearing disappeared entirely. The three of them sat close to the stove while the wind screamed around the cabin. Hours passed. The tree remained draped over the roof, but the reinforced structure distributed the weight evenly. The patched sections held. Daniel eventually leaned back against the wall and studied Evan. "Town said this place was falling apart," he said. "It was. And you fixed it." "I tried." Daniel's eyes shifted toward the door again. "If we'd stayed in that truck," he said quietly. Mara finished the thought. "We wouldn't have made it through the night." Evan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The storm raged until nearly dawn. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, it began to lose strength. The wind softened first, then the snowfall lightened. By morning, the clearing was buried under nearly 2 feet of snow. The fallen tree lay heavy across the roof, but the cabin stood. Evan stepped outside first, boots crunching deep. Daniel followed. They surveyed the damage. The truck down the road was nearly invisible under drifted snow. The cabin roof sagged slightly under the added weight of the fallen tree, but it hadn't collapsed. Daniel turned slowly toward Evan. "You didn't just survive out here," he said. "You built something that saved us." Evan looked at the cabin. $9, scrap metal, bent nails, insulation from a man who pretended not to care. "I just didn't want it to fall," he said. Daniel nodded once. "Well," he said quietly, "no one in Millstone Creek is going to believe this." And for the first time since he'd stood on that sidewalk with nowhere to go, Evan allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. By midday, word had reached town. Not because Evan told anyone, because Daniel did. The road crew came first, 2 county trucks pushing through drifts that rose nearly to their headlights. They found Daniel's pickup buried nose down in the ditch and worked an hour digging it free. By the time the truck was hauled back onto level ground, half of Millstone Creek knew what had happened. They had heard about the storm. They had seen the fallen trees along Cedar Run. They had seen the roof of the old Granger cabin still standing. That was what surprised them. When the first group walked up the path to the clearing, Evan was already on the roof. He had tied a rope around his waist and anchored it to the chimney pipe brace. He was cutting the fallen tree into sections, careful not to let the weight shift too suddenly. Snow clung to his boots. His hands were red from cold, despite the gloves. Below, Daniel stood with a shovel, ready to drag branches clear. Rick arrived a few minutes later. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and just stared. The cabin looked different now. Not broken, tested. The tree had dented one corner of the roof, but the reinforced beam held. The patched shingles were scuffed, but intact. The tar seam around the stovepipe hadn't split. Rick walked slowly around the structure. "You realigned that load path," he muttered to himself. Evan climbed down when the worst of the weight was removed. Rick met him halfway. "That beam should have failed," Rick said. "It almost did," Evan replied. "First week I was here." Rick nodded once, almost approvingly. "You fixed it, right?" Evan shrugged. "I just followed the grain." Daniel overheard that. "Followed the grain?" he asked. Evan nodded. My dad used to say wood tells you how it wants to carry weight. You just have to look. Rick looked at him carefully. You ever think about construction? He asked. Evan blinked. I never thought about anything past next week. By afternoon, more people filtered in. Tom from the hardware store, the waitress from the diner, even the uncle who had told him he was old enough to handle things on his own. He stood near the edge of the clearing, hands in his pockets, the same way he had that night. But his expression was different now, less certain. Daniel spoke first. If this kid hadn't reinforced this place, my wife and I would have frozen in that truck. The words landed heavier than the snow. People walked around the cabin, inspecting it. Tom ran his palm over the patched window frame. You did this with scrap? He asked. Mostly. Rick gestured toward the roofline. He redistributed the roof load and braced the stovepipe joint. Most grown men don't think to do that. Evan felt heat rise to his face. He wasn't used to people discussing him like that. His uncle finally stepped closer. You could have asked for help, he said quietly. Evan met his eyes. I did, he said simply. You said I could handle things on my own. Silence. The wind had softened to a steady whisper. Snow dripped slowly from tree branches, sunlight breaking through for the first time since the storm began. Daniel cleared his throat. There's going to be more storms, he said. That road bends wrong in heavy weather. We almost didn't see the drift. Tom nodded. That whole stretch is dangerous. Rick looked at the cabin again. Not for him, he said. An idea began forming in the quiet space between them. Daniel turned to Evan. You built this alone? Yes. You reinforced it in less than a month? Yes. Daniel looked at the others. Town's got 3 empty cabins in worse shape than this. County's been trying to auction them off for years. Tom folded his arms. You're thinking what I'm thinking. Rick nodded slowly. Let him fix them. Evan blinked. What? Rick faced him fully. You've got an eye for structure. You don't waste material. You don't panic under pressure, Daniel added. And you know what it means when something isn't just shelter. It's survival. The uncle shifted uncomfortably. He's still a kid, he muttered. Evan felt something shift inside him. No, he said calmly. I'm not. The statement didn't carry anger. It carried certainty. The clearing fell quiet again. Tom broke it first. I've got tools that don't move much these days, he said. You use them, you bring them back. Rick nodded. I'll show you how to assess foundations properly. You already understand more than you think. Daniel stepped closer. I run a small contracting business 2 towns over, nothing fancy, but I need someone who works like you do. Evan looked from one face to the next. The cabin behind him stood battered but upright. $9, a broken door, scrap nails, and a storm that nearly crushed it. He had bought shelter. He had built stability. He had unknowingly built proof. The uncle cleared his throat again. You could come back, he said quietly, until you get on your feet. Evan looked at the clearing, at the repaired beam, at the stovepipe venting steady white smoke into the clean winter air. I am on my feet, he said. There was no hostility in it, only fact. The town didn't laugh this time. They stood in a clearing where a broken cabin had done what they hadn't expected. It had endured. And so had the 17-year-old who refused to leave it. If you believe sometimes the smallest investment can change an entire direction, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you value stories about resilience built from almost nothing, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Because the cabin on Cedar Run wasn't just standing anymore. It was becoming something else entirely. And no one in Millstone Creek would ever look at it, or him, the same way again. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.